Hello there. My name's Leon Conrad from the Academy of Oratory, and I'm recording this session for the School of Civic Education, to whom I have to say a big thank you for offering me the opportunity to share some of my thoughts with you on story and life. And the proposition I want to put in front of you is that there is no distinction between story and life. I've been looking at story and how story works for quite a time now. I'm interested in communication, in public speaking, in voice production, in presentation skills, in the art of oratory. And stories have been around for a very long time. They have not changed very much in terms of structure. In fact, some of the oldest known written stories, which must have been told orally before writing was invented, have the same structures as many of the stories we tell today. The structures have not changed. It could be argued that they are part of our consciousness. And as such, I think it's worth looking at them to understand a bit about consciousness itself. Well, that's what I intend to do with you over the next 30-40 minutes. The proposition I put before you is that there is no distinction between story and life. What do I mean by that? Well, the word distinction is inspired by the work of a great British thinker, in my opinion. He's controversial, but he's done some fabulous work. His name is Professor George Spencer Brown. And in the 1960s, he wrote a book called The Laws of Form, in which he outlined a very powerful calculus that he argues underlies the thinking behind mathematics and language. He's applied it to logic, and I have applied it to the analysis of story structure. I'd like to take you through the first principles of it. It's very simple. And he starts with two basic assumptions. First of all, an act of distinction, and second of all, an act of indication. What does that mean? An act of distinction is like drawing a circle on a piece of paper. An act of indication means pointing either at the inside of the circle or the outside. If you're pointing to the inside, you're not pointing to the outside. If you're pointing to the outside, you're not pointing to the inside. That's basically it. But his system then expands on that. He says, if I'm pointing to the inside, I'm making a mark. It's like a thought appearing in the mind. And if I think Leon, but then I call Leon again, I'm making two marks. Leon, Leon. But there's only one Leon. So, the circle in his system can be written in shorthand like that. And if there are two marks, they can condense into one. And the other way round, one mark can expand into two. There's only one Leon, but you can call Leon twice. So, how does that relate to story? Well, before the mark can expand or contract, there was this state of distinction where we've made a distinction, but we haven't pointed either to the inside or the outside. So there's a state of uncertainty, of oscillation. And he uses this mark to indicate that. It's like the beginning of a story. Stories start once upon a time, very often. There are similar starting points in many languages. Stories are a universal phenomenon, and the structures of story are also universal. And they start with openings that typically confound our notions of space and time. Once upon a time, how can time, which is linear, ever have anything put on it? There was and there was not. You're never sure where you are with this, either in space or time. But the next thing, and this is the thing you have to feel in your gut when you're analyzing story structure, the change between one move and another. And a move is the change of state, whether something is expanding forward or contracting backwards. Now, before I go further, I want to outline my thinking about story, because I think of story in several levels. If we start at the most concrete level, we have narrative. That's a particular story, a particular version of a story you can point to. Say, Fellini's film of Romeo and Juliet, or the theatre production, your local theatre production of King Lear. Then there is, so that is a particular story. Then there is the story of Romeo and Juliet, which is told in many versions. That story has an underlying structure which is common to many stories, which could be called a metaplot, a master plot of the star-crossed lovers. And you can see it in many forms. Underlying that, this is the level I want to look at with you today, is the bare bones, the story structure, which is linked to content but separate to it. So, how does story structure work? Well, the easiest way for me to show you this is to look at a very popular story. You probably know it. It's called The Story of the Three Little Pigs. And the way it works is that you start with, once upon a time, there were three little pigs. And as soon as you've got the character you can point to, there's the mark. And you can go for a long time describing their characters and their mother and how they lived. And the first thing that moves the story along in this story is the problem. And the problem varies in different versions of the stories. But today, I'm going to tell you the version where the mother decides that it's time for her three little pigs to grow up, and they have to go into the world and become independent, self-sustaining little piggies. So, they start with a problem, and then they go on a journey. On their journey, they're moving forward, they're going through the world, and suddenly they're stopped in their tracks. And that is a backward move, because it stops them from continuing on their journey to fulfill and solve their problem. And the first thing that happens in the story, chronologically, and these steps happen chronologically, is that they meet people who have materials. And it's a very simple story, so these characters are almost one-dimensional. Their function is to supply the pigs with the materials they need to build their houses. So that is great. The pigs get their materials, they build their houses. That is a forward move. It helps them advance on the road to independence. But we all know where this is going. There is an enemy out there, the big bad wolf. And the big bad wolf comes and threatens them. There's this meeting. There they are with the big bad wolf. And in the first two cases, the big bad wolf destroys the first two pigs' houses. In some versions, they're eaten by the wolf. In some versions, they escape and join the third little pig, who's built a house of bricks. Then there's a confrontation. And it's on the third try, the try again repeated structure, that the little pigs together in the version where they survive, or the third little pig alone, defeats the wolf. And the result is that all three, or he, continues and becomes this independent, self-sustaining little pig, and lives happily ever after. And that ending, that closing, that traditional closing, takes you into the first state, the distinguished state which has not been indicated. That structure, which can have, these bits repeated, where the first pig goes out on his journey and has a problem, and the second pig goes out on the journey and has a problem, and the whole cycle is only repeated on the third time, is a very, very common story structure, which I call the quest. And it is the most efficient way of solving a problem that is within the hero's capacity to solve. Hero has a problem, he goes out, finds a friend or helper, and with the aid of that friend or helper, defeats the thing that's getting in the way, and life goes on. Now, this is a very simple rendition of a way of analyzing story structure. Each character has their path, and if I were analyzing this in depth, I would map the path and the moves of each character. When it comes to the wolf, he's not so straightforward. When he appears in front of the first little pig's house, he pretends to be a friend, but he's actually an enemy. So that is quite a common thing in life, where somebody or something that should be set up to help you actually gets in your way. That move I call a trickster move. You don't know which way it's going. Now, in trickster stories, and there are many, many trickster stories, they start from West Africa, Anansi the Spider, go across to America, Brer Rabbit stories. You can find them in Tom and Jerry cartoons, where one character tricks another, and that is called a dupe move, the first character is tricked, and then the character who's been tricked turns the tables on the trickster at the end. Now, the pattern follows the same number of moves as the quest structure. So you have the once upon a time beginning. There was, or actually in the trickster structure, is typically two characters that are on conflicting quests. The thing one character wants is exactly the opposite of the thing the other one wants. So, let me draw this again. They have a problem, they go on a journey, they have a meeting. There's the first trickster move. That results in another meeting. The second trickster move. And the final state of being. Now, the difference between a trickster structure and a quest structure is that here the status quo remains the same. The ending position is the same as the starting position. Nothing improves. Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox are still enemies. In the quest, there's one character, very clear helper, very clear enemy. The enemy's defeated, the problem solved. The enemy isn't always defeated, but that just takes you back to your problem state, and you can only defeat the problem efficiently if you go through that set of moves. How is this relevant to life? Well, as we go through life, we meet problems. No story can unfold without a problem. The Three Little Pigs would be very boring without the big bad wolf. Who has lived a life which is problem-free? I know I haven't. But what mechanisms or structures do we use to solve our problems? Stories, I think, have an internal wisdom, a wisdom that is part of our consciousness. And as such, I think is a very valuable thing to look at. Now, many of us have problems that we can solve, and we use the quest structure to go on a quest and solve them. But what happens when we encounter situations in life where someone we go to as a friend or something we look upon as a friend or helper is actually getting in the way? We're stuck. We either go into the trickster pattern, or we can choose to go back and say, right, this is a problem. What's my next move? Where can I find a friend or helper that will help me defeat my enemy? By doing that, we get into a more positive attitude towards solving a problem in our lives, rather than being stuck into the trickster pattern where somebody's played on trick on us, we have to get our own back on them. We think, let's see. Now I've identified this thing or person as an enemy, not a friend, who I can turn to as a friend. How can they help me? And I know, because I know story, that it might not work first time round. I have to sometimes try again. And it still may not work. And I'm left with a problem. But I still know there are friends and helpers out there that will help me ultimately defeat the enemy and solve the problem. So, what's the relevance? If these story structures are part of consciousness, and there's a feeling to a story that the movement in a story is like a pendulum. You start in an off-center position, and in order to get to a better equilibrium, you have to kick yourself on one direction and increase the momentum. Go here, then there, then boom. And it's with the last biggest jump that you can get the momentum to stabilize and then go on a new journey. That's what stories are all about. That's what life is all about, as far as I'm concerned. There are 14 structures I've identified that are distinctive. I've just shared 2 with you. These 14 are independent of comedy and tragedy, which I think are structure neutral. They can be applied to any structure. Comedy is based on category mistakes, Aristotelian category mistakes, and tragedy on category corrections. I'm not the only person to have looked at story structures. There are others from Prop, who's looked at 31 functions of story, vital things that need to come in a certain order, but they don't all need to be there. Structuralists, Levi-Strauss, Dundas, and others, Greimas, who has noted this duality, this to and fro aspect to story, the tick-tock that underlies both story and musical rhythm. And it underlies our heartbeats. What people like Christopher Booker, who's written a book called The 7 Types of Plot, have done is look more closely at content than the underlying structure. So my invitation to you is to look at the underlying structure of story and analyze incidents in your own lives, analyze stories as well, familiar stories from your childhood. The old fairy tales are the simplest and the easiest to analyze. And then once you're familiar with the structures, see how that applies to everyday life. Now, the other thing that you can do is, if you notice a trickster structure, try to understand what is motivating the character that's getting in the way, trying to play a trick on you. What is it they want? You're on your own quest. You know what you want to achieve. What do they want to achieve? If you can identify that, you might be able to play the role of a friend or helper to them, rather than them having to see you as their enemy and pretend to be your friend to play a trick on you. That's another way of looking at it. So, rather than you being the main character and going on the quest, perhaps there may be a time where you can come in and play the role of the friend or helper and join together to defeat the enemy. There is one more structure I want to share with you. But before I do, I want to ask a question. What would a story be like that didn't have any backward moves? Is there a story or story type you can think of that just expands, keeps on going forward? It might look a bit like this. Going on forever. There is a type of stories that fits this model, and it's the creation myth. Stories about how the world came to be that typically start with an initial state of chaos, an oscillation, a formless, unknown, something that can only be described as nothing, that distinguishes itself. And it's the only way it can see itself, and from there it can expand and multiply. For Spencer Brown, there is no distinction between a mark on a piece of paper, the person who is making that mark, who is themselves a mark in the environment they're in, and the first distinction. If everything goes back to that first initial state, and everything comes from that, it's no wonder that there is no distinction, or there can be thought to be no distinction, between story and life. But all you're doing, you might say, is distinguishing one thought from another. And if you're looking at two thoughts, of course, they can be merged and be thought of as an act of thinking. If an act of thinking is just another token of the first act of distinction, then there is no distinction. And if that is the case, then the quest story, where we have a problem and we have to meet a friend or helper in order to face our enemies and adversaries and defeat them, actually is irrelevant, because life just flows. We have these type of stories. They are part of our consciousness. And we know there's research been done. Csikszentmihalyi has written about flow, that state of inspired consciousness you get into. When you're in the groove, you're completely immersed in something and you lose track of space and time. Creation myths structurally do exist in our lives. What if our quest could be to transcend the quest structure and follow a creation myth structure in our lives? What would life be like then? I'll leave that with you to think about. If you'd like to explore story structures a bit more, look at the analysis of traditional stories from your cultures, share some of my thinking about stories from my cultures. I'm half Egyptian, half Polish. I work within the English language. Then I would be more than happy to do that and then analyze some situations from social political contexts and see how to apply story structures to solving practical problems. I've given you a glimpse as to how that might help you and how we can do that. Where you take this is your own story. May it lead you to live happily ever after.